Okay, how's it going, Ron? All right?
Doing good, doing good,
Good.
doing good. And yourself?
Not too bad, not too bad. Today
Very
we're going
good.
to talk about photos in the attic. Okay. So my uncle was a journalist and he was the editor of one of the Boston newspapers. I'm not going to say which one. So he had this collection of photos that when he became the editor, all the previous editors kept these photos, and they're sort of iconic photos, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to show a few of those photos and then just talk about them, talk about the history and the context of them. But before we do one of his photos, he was a correspondent in the Second World War for the newspaper in the London office, right? So I remember talking. So it was during the Blitz, and he talked to
Mm.
me, and he told stories about how he used to when the Blitz happened and they were in their office, he used to have to go underneath the desk and wait for the bombs to finish. And he said, you just didn't know. You can hear the bombs going bam, 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 and then they would stop because they'd finish that bomb run, or else get closer, 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 or else what he did say though. Now I don't know what part of London he was based in. I'm sure he wasn't the East End. He might have been, but the East End is
Probably
where.
Fleet. Would he have been Fleet Street?
You're right,
Would you
actually.
know?
Very good point. Yes. So that would
Probably.
have been center-ish. So, but this is a photo which we're just bringing up here, and it's for those. It's incredible. It's a photo of St. Paul's Cathedral, which, as far as I know, and you might correct me on this one, it wasn't touched, was it?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it had like shrapnel damage and maybe a little bit of damage, but I mean, ultimately it survived,
Yeah.
which was nothing short of a miracle. Even shall we say, you were saying maybe the Germans wouldn't have intentionally targeted it for
Yeah.
cultural reasons, because it's a great landmark. The state of precision bombing in 1940, especially at night, was pretty laughable. They hit within a mile or two of the target. That's good.
It's the accuracy, 1 mile or two.
Yeah, yeah, it really was. And actually, really, sorry, slight aside, accurate bombing, if you like, actually being able to put a bomb on target and not hit everything around it, if you like. We only came in probably later stage of the Vietnam War. They invented laser guided bombs.
Right.
And before that, I mean, even right up to in the mid 1960s, they were still basically just flying over and dropping a load of dumb iron bombs. So, yeah, you can imagine it was more of a weight of bombing rather than accuracy that did the damage.
I was doing a tour of St. Paul's, and the tour guide told us the reason it wasn't bombed during the Second World War is because it's technically a compass.
Hmm.
Because all cathedrals point from east to west, and actually most churches. Next time you're driving past a church, look at the back of the church,
No,
yeah, and it's probably facing west.
yes, maybe you could argue that they thought that, like it would have been a landmark, but no, I mean, sure. Sure, when the RAF started heavily bombing Germany,
Yeah,
the Americans at the time were saying, no, we're going to go in the daylight and do precision bombing.
yeah.
And the RAF correctly kind of said, geez, we're just going to flatten the city because that's the only way to guarantee you get stuff. So in 1940, especially, I mean, very primitive technique. So sometimes a lead bomber would drop its bombs in Kent or Essex by mistake, and sure, the rest of the bombers would all just bomb there because that's where the fire on the ground was. It was so that it wasn't. It was very crude, very crude. Yeah.
I just finished a book called Catch 22. Did you ever read Catch
Oh,
22? Brilliant. It's about these guys who were the bombers in the Med. They were on some Italian island, and it was just a disaster. They just kept bombing the wrong places. It was kind of like one guy would actually drop the bombs way too early, and they all would, and then they
yeah,
just realized that they just put their bombs in the sea, and that was it. But they,
that's it.
so they,
Uh,
but they
yeah.
basically fly back and say, "No, yeah, it was great, did a great job, did a great job," So
Oh yeah. No, I just to say, I think a lot of that is exaggerated, but ultimately, it's not totally divorced from the truth. The big thing, of course, was that originally, as it stood, if you were a bomber crew coming into Europe or the Med or whatever, your tour of duty would be like, I think it was 25 missions. And once you did, if you survived 20 minutes, and that was a big if because less than half of them did, either ended up in prisoners of war or dead, you get a rotation back to the States for a few months. And the thing about Catch 22, I think the whole story is that the general in charge keep stretching out. So it's 20 missions, then it's 25, and then actually no lads, it's 30. So everyone starts getting a bit crazy because
yeah,
Christ's sake, what's happening? And of course, your man Yossarian, the main guy, he's trying to get sent home on grounds of insanity. So he's
mm,
acting mad. But of course, it's Catch 22 is where the word, because if you're actually saying you want to go home from this crazy situation, then by definition you're sane. And the guys who are truly insane or psychotic, they don't, yeah, send me again, baby. I want to drop some bombs and I love the adrenaline. So that's the catch-22.
And the actual definition of craziness is to go on the bomb mission. So you're crazy to go on the bomb mission, and you're sane to get out of it. That's great. So tell me about St. Paul's then. Did the Germans bomb the East End because of industry, or were they after people?
I know, it's industry. I mean, you got to remember that even actually late in the late war, you had like the so-called flying bombs and the V-2 rockets hitting. They were just merely aimed at London. That's it, because that's as accurate. They could reasonably expect them to hit somewhere in Greater London. It's a pretty big target. And in fact, the story behind the Blitz and bombing of London in the first place is probably why the Germans failed to destroy the RAF in the Battle of Britain. And it was just, again, stupid, if you like. What happened was they were expressly told in the early stages, Hitler said, don't bomb London. Because I think he was still hoping that he could come to terms with Britain. You know, he kind of was, oddly, he was admired them. So what happens is, one night, I think in August or whenever it was, it's depicted, by the way, in a very, very good movie, The Battle of Britain, which is I enjoy. A single German bomber, off course, lost, didn't know where the hell they were. They kind of said, all right, we have to go home, so let's just ditch the bombs. And the guy sort of said, where are we? We're like over nothing, but he wasn't. They were over London, and they dropped the bombs in London. And in response, Churchill sent the RAF to Berlin. Now, you know, that stage where they did very little damage, but the whole fact that the RAF bombed Berlin, Hitler went nuts, and he said, right, we're going to raise your cities. And then so what happened was the effort of the German Air Force switched from absolutely hammering the RAF airfields, which was, you know, RAF were fighter command were kind of on the point of collapse at that stage. They switched then, so and the RAF were like, "Oh, this is great. I mean, it's terrible they're bombing London, but they're not bombing us." So they were able to rebuild their strength and everything. And from that point on, it was just a numbers game, and the Germans eventually gave up, essentially, you know, because the RAF, they couldn't beat the RAF. They were very impressive.
How bad was London bombed in the Blitz?
I think, well, pretty badly. I mean, predominantly the East End, because obviously they're coming from that direction, and you're right.
That's where all the shipping is and the ports.
Yeah,
and
like
right,
warehouses and you know, was it the Royal Albert Docks and all those places? That's all there. So that, and of course, that was still at that stage. I mean, nowadays the equivalent is you'd be bombing Felixstowe or one of these big container ports, but that was such a main port. But I mean, because I said the nature of it, with the particularly when they started bombing it, switched to bombing at night, loads of places got hit. Probably every single part of London had at least a couple of bombs falling, at least, including, of course, famously a few bombs hit Buckingham Palace, and apparently the King and Queen were delighted because the Queen, who became the Queen Mother to us, if you like, she said she felt it was great. I can kind of look the East End in the eye and say, we're in it together.
Fantastic. And of course, one famous one was the Crystal Palace got boxed up. They basically, they actually boxed the whole Crystal Palace up and sent it away to some warehouse, and the area where the Crystal Palace was didn't get bombed, and where they put the boxes did get bombed. So they actually
screwed anyway.
They put it in the place which got bombed. If they had just left it, it wouldn't have got bombed. But of course, all much easier said than done. Okay, well,
So that is fascinating, all right?
It is amazing. Yeah, it's an incredible photo. It really is. God, war. What a this one of Pearl Harbor. It's you know, it's like I always think to myself, how in God's name did you have the time to take a photo? This whole thing is shocking, right? This absolute shock of what's happening. And as a journalist, you're there going, oh my God, I'm at this time trying to figure out, you're actually even trying to figure out what the hell is going on, right?
No.
And so it's kind of like what is actually happening here. And then to be able to take this, like this photo here, I think is extraordinary. This is, you can tell what about
the USS Arizona, isn't it? Yeah.
That is the Arizona,
Yeah. I suppose if you think about it, if you know the way, you know, the bystander thing, in most of these big explosive situations, you could say, The majority of us, you can do nothing. You're just there. You can't change the outcome. You're not fighting the war. You're not there in a fireboat, whatever. So what can you do? You have a camera. You're a journalist, so you take photos. I suppose that's just really it.
Just to give people the actual context, this photo itself is so 1941. This photo is 85 years old.
December, isn't it? I think
Yeah,
a day that'll live in infamy.
So this actual photo is 85 years old. God, it is. So this is actually the photo that what my uncle, the editor at the time for the paper that my uncle worked for, he was given one of about, say, 100 photos that were sent around to all the different newspapers.
Wire service, they call it.
Yeah. So he was given this photo, and it was his choice whether to publish the photo or not to publish the photo. So my uncle reckons about 90% of them got thrown in the bin. So they are incredibly rare. Like this, like it is incredible to touch this, to actually touch this photo, knowing that a journalist in 1941 was making a choice, holding the exact same thing, not even knowing which way like the war was going.
Hold them up to the light and say which one will we use.
Yeah.
And of course, as you say as well, there'd be national security things. So if a photo, say, happened to have a lot of the names of ships in it, or clear evidence of numbers of ships, they'd probably say you can't publish that. But obviously, this really just shows like the Japanese kind of knew that they'd hit the ship, because it pretty much blew up, huge explosion. And
was this the one where the bomb went into it and into the actual arms dump on the ship?
One of the Japanese dive bombers, one of the bombs went into the magazine, ship's magazine, and boom. You can imagine, therefore, almost for propaganda purposes, of course you'd want to publish this picture, because it would really rile up the public and get them behind the war effort. Like, we want revenge. But there's a similar situation about the year earlier. The Bismarck was the big German battleship.
Yes.
And the Royal Navy went on the hunt for the Bismarck in 1940. And ultimately they did sink it, because the Royal Navy was massively bigger than the Kriegsmarine. But famously,
that was a ship that sunk the Hood and the Prince of Wales, wasn't it?
Yes.
The Bismarck sunk.
No, it didn't. It didn't. It damaged the Prince of Wales. And actually, that, again, one of these podcasts talk. The Prince of Wales was brand new, and they could only get the guns were only intermittently working. They had actually civilian technicians from the shipyard on the ship trying to fix the guns. It did get damaged. It didn't sink. But what happened was that the Hood and the Prince of Wales came across. They engaged the Bismarck, and they were firing away. And I think it was just pure, incredible luck. You could say that one of the very first shells that the Bismarck fired direct hit on the Hood's magazine, and she just blew up. And there's only 3 survivors.
Jesus.
After ships, thousands of men, 3 survivors.
Survivors, like, yeah. So even though the Prince of Wales was nearby, they couldn't pick. Like, they just died from the explosions and fires.
Massive explosion. I mean, it detonated the ship. The whole ship went up like a bomb, like a big bomb. I mean, you can imagine you would have had tons and tons and tons of explosives. These explosive charges to fire the shells on the ship's guns. Frequently, if you look at warship design, particularly in that era, with the big gun era, if there's elevators go down into the ship from the turrets, from the guns, into these armored kind of rooms that are meant to try and be the most protected part of the ship. Because if, as you say, if they get hit, the whole ship goes up. It's a very vulnerable part.
Why in Pearl Harbor did they line the battleships up? Was that just how it was always done?
It's worse than that in a way. They were at peacetime, essentially. Now, you could argue they should have known. I mean, they weren't stupid. They knew that a war was coming, or likely, because what was going on in the Western Pacific with the war in China and Japan actually, you could say part of the reason that they attacked the United States was the United States were embargoing oil and other stuff to them. They were choking them off. But you see, they were a little bit old-fashioned. They thought, okay, so we're probably going to end up, the Japanese will declare war, and we'll sail out of Pearl Harbor as a big fleet, and we'll all have a massive battle off the coast of the Philippines or something, and that'll be that. But the Japanese, interesting enough, inspired by the British, the Royal Navy the year before in Taranto in Italy, realized the Royal Navy had a huge success with these biplane. They look ancient, but they're pretty good fairy swordfish. And they went into Taranto on the heel of Italy, and they managed to sink half the Mediterranean Italian fleet. And it did not go unnoticed by the Japanese, and they copied a lot of the things that the British did in their attack on Pearl Harbor.
So was the Toronto then, was that the first use of an aircraft carrier, so to speak, in battle?
Was it? No, not quite, but it was one of the first. Certainly, probably the first really significant one. In other
Yeah.
words, what I can't remember what it was. It was like illustrious. One of the Royal Navies. They were like generally the Mediterranean was a British lake at that time.
Yes.
And the only other significant powers would have been the French Navy and the Italian Navy. And to show how ruthless the Brits were, I mean, they weren't,
Yes.
they actually
They sunk
gave
the
an
French
ultimatum
Navy.
to the French fleet in Algeria. Because at the fall of France, the French fleet sailed from Marseille and went across to North Africa and just holed up there. They didn't know what to do. And they were torn. Like they were saying, if we go across the Allies, they'd take it out in our families back in France and so on. Or under, I think it was Admiral Cunningham. Or anyway, it was typical Royal Navy. They're Nelsonian. They just charge in. They gave an ultimatum and said, listen, you can either scuttle your ships, like open sea cocks, sink them in the harbour. You can sail out under our flag and join our cause, or we will destroy you. And they gave him an ultimatum. Ultimatum passed, and the Royal Navy opened fire, and they killed about 3,000 French soldiers and sank a bunch of ships. Like, brutal stuff.
Technically, the English were at war with the French at that time. Like, technically, because didn't English
Well,
soldiers shoot French sailors who were trying to protect the boats, didn't they?
I don't know. Well, I mean, they did. Look, like, there's no question they did attack, lethally attack the French Navy. But I think that was about the extent of it. Now there were other, yes, like for example, there was French soldiers in Syria, for example, the Levant, Palestine, that sort of thing, and they had a short sort of, basically, put up a token resistance just to say, yeah, we did our duty, and the British took over the French possessions in that part of the world. And then, of course, the same thing happened in Operation Torch in late 42. It was a combined British-American landing, and so that's kind of the first big involvement of America in the European War. And interestingly enough, all the British planes that took part, they painted them in American markings because the Vichy Friends, or the French forces there, hated the British for what they'd done.
Really? This is the USS West Virginia. She was also there, was she, in Pearl Harbor?
Yes. And actually, the interesting about that is that's later in the war. It actually managed to salvage it, raise it, and fix it, and it actually participated in later war. That's the one that people might have seen a pretty awful movie by, was it Michael Bay or something, Pearl Harbor. It's garbage. But it's like so inappropriate. Like they're trying to put this love story around.
Just get on with the bombing. That's like, I was shouting halfway through.
If the ladies don't want to go see it, show us a good movie. But what happened was, there's a Cuba Gooding Jr. He plays a guy called Doris Miller, who was a cook on the West Virginia. At that stage, the African Americans, they were not allowed anywhere near guns, or they were always in support roles like cooks, cleaners, whatever on the ship.
Okay.
But because there was such chaos and there was fire and everything on the ship, he ran out to the deck, and there was an anti-aircraft gun there, which I think the crew had been killed, probably machine gun by a Japanese plane. So he hopped on it and officially shot down at least one Japanese aircraft, and witness reports say maybe even 4 or 5. So he's quite famous for that. Wow. And several of his commanders all said he should get the Medal of Honor, but he didn't. He got the Navy Cross, which is still pretty damn good. But the only reason he didn't get the Medal of Honor was that the then chief of the Navy sort of was thinking, well, we don't officially allow blacks in combat, so sorry. You know what I mean? It's racist crap.
Well, what was the damage? Did they sink like 80% of the battleships, or like? I actually didn't know that they got a boat back up again and got it fixed.
No, in
fact, I thought they were all done.
Most of them did.
Oh, really?
Well, very quickly. There was two waves of attacks, and there was NT a third, but they cancelled it because they felt, no. Here's the thing. Ultimately, yes, it was a failure because, interestingly enough, it proved the point that actually battleships are nearly obsolete now, guys. It's all about the aircraft carriers. And now ultimately Japan would have lost the war no matter what, because eventually Americans would have come back at them with their superior economic output and all that. But all the fleet carriers, I think the 4 main carriers, like the Yorktown, the Hornet, they were out at sea on an exercise, pure chance. So if they'd been in harbour, they would have been sunk. And interesting enough,
Wow.
so what happened was if Pearl Harbor, there's an island in the center called Ford Island, and the ships along one side was docking for battleships called Battleship Row. And there's about 8 of them docked two abreast.
Mhm.
So obviously the Arizona exploded. West Virginia actually got underway, but I think was damaged and it capsized, I believe. There was another ship that actually got the boilers, the steam up and got them underway, a few of them. And they also, I think, survived because one captain realized the ship was going down and he steered it to the shore and beached it. That kind of thing.
Wasn't it famously that was Armin Yamamoto's great line? He said, "I fear we
Yeah,
awoken a sleeping giant." Such a
he
great
was
line,
right.
And he's
He,
right.
had lived in the United States in previously as like a student or whatever, so he kind of really understood the States, whereas the rest of the Japanese didn't.
Well, he basically, so he wasn't naive to it, so to speak.
No, not at all. But it
Wow.
just finally is just so there's two waves, right, of attacks. The
Mm-hmm.
third wave might have made some impact in the sense that the first two waves concentrated on the ships, but one thing they didn't bomb was the dry dock facilities and the oil storage farms all around the harbor. They survived, which meant that they were able to get the port up and running. If they had bombed those, destroyed those facilities, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have had to pull back to the west coast.
Wow. So just moving on. This is now
Yeah.
another one of my uncle's photos, and this is relatively rare because
Oh yeah.
as a
Roosevelt,
lot of
yeah.
as a lot of people might know, if you ever see any photos of Roosevelt during the war, he's either sitting in a car or the famous photo of him at Yalta. They're all sitting down. So obviously, Stalin and Churchill agreed that they'd all sit down. Then the press came in, so it looked like. So it was very rare. It wasn't an actual moratorium as far as I know. Like the government didn't say you're not allowed to do it. I think the
No, I think it's
media
just
said,
a different era. The media kind of said, "Look, let's sort of not bring it to attention that the president is basically paralyzed from the waist down." He
yeah,
got polio as a young man, and that was the result of polio. If it didn't kill you, it could put you, it would paralyze you, or worse still, put you in an iron lung, which is a very different. I'm not going to go into, but that's why I think these anti-vaxxers are out of their effing
sure,
minds. I mean, what
I
the hell?
know,
This is the reality. They
yeah,
say things like, "Well, we don't need it. There's no polio." It's like, well, okay, give it a few years, and you're going to have to see this crap again.
yeah. But let me ask you a question then. When he was going for office, was he also disabled?
No, he was. And interesting enough, he used to like actually that famous thing, a day this address he gave to Congress after Pearl Harbor,
Yes.
a date that if you notice, he's always standing at the lectern because what they had was he had these, apparently they're quite painful as well, basically metal calipers that would be attached to his legs and then they'd be locked in position so he'd be able to stand up.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. They made huge. I mean, for example, little interesting things. When he went to the Casablanca conference in 1943, which was just him and Churchill, because Stalin wouldn't travel really outside the Soviet Union. Um, he came over in one of the ships. I think it was one of the big Iowa class ships, and famously to this day, the stateroom that they prepared for him, the cabin basically, it had the only bath on any battleship. It was like a luxury, well, not a luxury bath, but
You serious? Yeah, of course.
adaptation, so he could use it. Equally, I've seen his plane, like his, if you like, Air Force One, was nicknamed the Sacred Cow, which is kind of funny. But it's in the Air Force Museum, and it's a four-engined. It's basically a DC-4, which was the next one after the DC-3. So an early plane, but very capable. And it's the actual plane that took him to Yalta for the Yalta conference in 1945. But what's really interesting is this photograph that you have up there of him being carried. They didn't really want that into. He would have had to been carried up the stairs into the plane. So, and it's on show in the museum. They had a little, like a dumb waiter, a little thing came down out of the back,
Mm-hmm.
and so it was that they'd roll him in the wheelchair and it would take him back up. So it'd be kind of a subtle way of getting him on board without showing his disability to all the world.
It's quite extraordinary that nobody did the American public not know. Genuinely.
I'd say a lot. People, well, you know yourself. I mean, even to this day, there's people. You remember the last presidential election 2 years ago? Like, you hear these like, "Oh, we're not sure, we're undecided," and it's like, geez, how can you not have an opinion on two very divisive characters?
Yeah.
But it was the same in World War II. I'm sure there's lots of people who paid very little attention. Only maybe if their relative was in the war, that would capture their attention. But the president, people who were in the know and in politics would know that he had this
Fascinating.
disability. But it just felt
It's an extraordinary look how proud he is. Or not proud, look
Yeah.
how determined he is. Like, this is
Oh
me.
yeah.
Like,
He's
it's
an impressive
extraordinary.
guy. Yeah. But of course, he's the reason.
When do you
He's
reckon
the
that was
reason.
taken? What would you guess?
Well, he died in March 45. He
Yeah.
actually died before Hitler did. Truman became president at the end of the war. Um, that's
He looks
probably,
relatively healthy though, doesn't he? He looks relatively healthy.
yeah, I would say that's 1944. Actually, he wasn't, believe it or not. What killed him in the end, while he died, was he had a stroke. He was,
Oh,
because I think he was a heavy smoker and he had other health issues besides that. I
yeah.
suppose in those days as well. If you actually, an interesting thing is the governor of Texas is a guy called Greg Abbott, and he's in a wheelchair, and that's just completely obvious. He's in a wheelchair. He doesn't hide it at all. A
Yeah.
different era there, a totally different era, really.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm going to put up a photo here. Number, I'm not 100% too sure when this was taken, but it's I still think it's an interesting photo to see, obviously. But I'm going to guess this is towards, like, that's
Oh,
towards,
Eisenhower.
yeah. So that's towards the end of the war, right? Would you think so? He's kind of knowing,
It's like
okay,
someone
or
beside him is just
yeah.
let rip with a massive fart.
He's saying, what the hell happened there? He kind of looks like, is he, what star general? He doesn't have a stars there. Was he
He was a
5-star all the way?
five-star. Yeah.
And for the whole
Essentially,
war?
yeah. What happened was he was, I think, at the start of the war, he might have been a 2 or 3-star general,
Yeah.
but he quickly rose the ranks because obviously very capable. The marshal was the chief of the army, and he was a 5-star. So what they did was they made Eisenhower a 5-star to be equivalent with that. Equally, then the British made Montgomery a field marshal, which was the equivalent. And then, would you believe MacArthur, who was a pretty lamentable character, really, Douglas MacArthur, he kicked the stink, so he was given a 5th star as well. But interestingly, it's been abolished since the war. They've gone back to 4 stars as the top.
What part of the armed forces was he in? Was he Army? Was he?
Oh yeah, Army all the way. Now, and don't forget, really, there was the Army and the Navy and maybe the Coast Guard, because the Marines were part of the Navy and actually still are. It wasn't the United States Air Force, it was the United States Army Air Force. It was only in 1947 that they became an independent branch of the military. So yeah, he would have been in charge of the Air Force, air power and land power. It was quite a huge operation, obviously.
Did the British have to do what he said? Was that part of the deal that the States made, that you had to follow what Eisenhower said?
Kind of. I mean, there's a word I love, realpolitik. The reality was,
yes.
yeah, of course they could say piss off, but then they'd say, okay, well, we're not giving you the shipping and we're not giving you the tank. They were totally much as we are today, really, for defense. They were totally dependent on the United States. So yeah, now Montgomery was a famously prickly character, and in fact, what was it? The second in command, actually, overall, was a guy called Tedder, a Royal Air Force guy, actually, and a very capable guy. And he used to decry, and of course, he then, after the war, Montgomery took over was the chief of the British Armed Forces, and basically sidelined you, man, because he felt, yeah, you're too friendly with the Yanks, It's all politics, goes on everywhere.
Isn't that extraordinary? I've never heard of Tedder. Like that's amazing. Not to hear ever of the second, because I thought I knew a lot about the Second World War, but and that's extraordinary. I don't even know who the second in command was.
There's a bunch of these characters. Another guy called Admiral Cunningham, I think, and he was like he would have been behind a lot of the Royal Navy success in the Med. Really capable guys. Oh, what's the other guy? God, he's actually a Northern Irish guy who was the main. He was like the main military advisor to Churchill and overall commander of British forces. Sorry, anyway, by the way, I probably that's incorrect. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander Europe, but whereas it was Nimitz and MacArthur were in the Navy. The Western Pacific MacArthur Army, the rest was Nimitz Navy.
Right.
And over all of them was George C. Marshall, who was the chief of the army. And then after the war, as a politician, he was the guy who came up with the Marshall Plan to essentially defeat communism by feeding people, and they wouldn't go over to the Soviets.
Which is not genius, which is a pretty genius idea, to be honest, as opposed to having the Versailles Treaty, where you just make a country go bankrupt, and then they go, well, hang on a second here, and then Eastern Theater, not the Eastern Theater, Pacific
Theater. It is
Theater.
the Marines. It's the U.S. Marine Corps raising the flag on Iwo Jima in, I think, around April 1945. Because don't forget, the war continued for a few months longer in the Pacific.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, just to finish that point about the picture of Eisenhower, I'm guessing that might have been around the winter of 1944, because he was wearing a grey coat. And
Oh yes, very
who
good.
knows? It's probably just a random picture. This is a brilliant picture. The thing was, the only reason they went to capture Iwo Jima was because it was literally to provide an emergency landing airstrip for the bombers going back and forth to bomb the B-29s. Ultimately, the last two were nuclear, but they did a lot of fire bombing and conventional bombing. But they said, well, let's capture this little basically island with a volcano and an airstrip in the middle of nowhere, but it's
Hmm.
on the route to Japan from the Marianas where they were flying the bombers from. And it turned into an absolute bloodbath because the Japanese defended it fanatically and actually quite effectively. So therefore, huge number of casualties. But this particular flag raising was actually the second time. There was an earlier flag raising, but then they did it again with a bigger flag, if you like. They said we need a bigger flag because a lot of the island couldn't see the flag. And of course, you can imagine.
Okay.
Oh, and the other interesting thing I was reading about this today. So they raised this flag, and apparently the Japanese defenders were all in caves and tunnels and everything, and they were keeping their head down because they were under a lot of fire. But when these guys put this up, apparently there was massive cheering all over the island, and of course, the ships out on sea were hooting their horns and everything. It was fabulous.
Mhm.
And of course, these poor guys then come under fire because the Japanese are like, "What's going on here? What's going? Oh my God, shoot these guys!"
Oh Jesus! So that actually
Yeah.
wasn't the end, so to speak, of the battle
Well,
for Iwo Jima. It wasn't.
no, it was towards the end. What they're on top of is Mount Suribachi, which is it's a little volcanic rise on the island. Otherwise, it's completely flat.
Yeah.
But it was near the end. And actually, I think of the 6 men in that photo, I think there's 6 in total. Three were ultimately killed. Only 3
Oh,
survived the war. So
yeah.
it was It's the official. There's a Marine Corps memorial, World War II Marine Corps memorial in yeah,
In Washington, D.C.
yeah, well,
That's
outside
right.
Washington, where's the where Quantico or wherever the Marine Corps headquarters is, and it's that it depicts the statue of that famous flag raising, something else,
And so the purpose of getting the island was to be another landing strip, or it was
basically,
right.
yeah, it literally just to be a stepping stone, so that what frequently was happening was if these B-29 bombers be gone over daily, nightly, I guess, to bomb Tokyo, wherever, all over Japan. If they got hit by anti-aircraft fire or shot at by a fighter but weren't actually shot down, they'd try and get back to base, but frequently they just couldn't, and they'd crash into the sea, and that at the end of them, because sure, you can imagine the vastness of the Pacific at night. You're going to have very hard time to get to. So the
Amazing.
idea being is that this would make it very handy. And actually, this is the tragedy about a lot of these battles in World War II. Ultimately, they probably didn't need to. They could have probably bypassed it and saved tens of thousands of lives. You know what I mean? But they
But
didn't
how
know that at
far?
the time.
But how far had they got to bombing Japan yet? Like
Oh,
I know that didn't Doolittle get there after Pearl Harbor, right? So he was the first, but he had to crash down in China or something. Did he? Yeah.
it was what they did actually. They launched B-25 bombers, which are kind of early wars, very capable. Actually, that's the type of bomber that was in Catch-22, the B-25. But very good. But they launched a bunch of them off a Navy carrier. Now, it wasn't a carrier ship, so they kind of amazingly got them all off the deck. A few of them nearly crashed into the sea, and they had to launch early because they were sailing towards their position where they'd have less distance to cross. And they came across a Japanese fishing trawler, and they sank it, but they couldn't be sure that it hadn't radioed ahead, so they had
Okay.
to launch because they did. They bombed Tokyo and did minor damage, nothing major. But of course, it was a bit like the RAF bombing Berlin. The Japanese were furious that this could happen,
Yeah.
and they either crashed and died or were killed or put in captivity. And some of them made it to China and within Chinese lines because they were allies. And then including what's his name, the Doolittle. Yeah, he survived and wasn't captured. So, but that
Yeah.
was only just the thing. Once they captured the Marianas, which is Saipan, which of course famously the Roy Keane Ireland thing in 19 or
Oh
what
yeah, that's
2002.
right. Yes. Yes.
That's where
Yeah.
they're the islands where those air bases were. That's Tinian is where, or is it one of them, Saipan. That's where they launched the atomic bombings to Japan from. And
Right.
so in a way, they didn't really need Iwo Jima. It was just a little bit of insurance, and ultimately, very questionable was worth it. It did, by the way, make them realize that the next battle after that, and probably the last major one of the war, because the bomb was dropped and then that ended the war before, was Okinawa. And when that was after Iwo Jima, and they kind of knew, oh my God, we're in for an unbelievable fight here. If they fight this hard for a little patch of black rock in the volcanic rock, what are they going to be like for Okinawa? And indeed, it was a brutal campaign.
And who owns the island now? Sorry. Yeah, who owns?
I'm guessing Japan, possibly.
Yeah,
Obviously, they didn't. If you like stuff that was Japanese pre-World War II, they lost some of it. Is it Sakhalin Island? It's this
that's
long
right.
island that's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
north. It actually was the southern half was Japanese, northern half was Russian, or so whatever Soviet. And after the war, obviously the Russians took the whole thing over. Yeah, that was mainly. But I think the Okinawa is an interesting case because it was technically like a U.S. military protectorate, if you like. They were in charge of it, but
Yeah.
still, it was sovereign was Japan. Yeah.
Gee,
This is the Times Square one.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to finish off with this now. This is
Okay.
VJ Day, right? Which so VJ Day. So it's Times Square. It's a photograph by Alfred Eisenstadt, and is published in Life magazine in 1945 with the caption: "In New York's Times Square, a white-clad girl clutches her purse and skirt as an uninhibited sailor plants his lips squarely on hers." There you go.
I know. So this was what 15th, 16th of August 1945. So Hiroshima 6th of August, Nagasaki 9th of August.
Yeah.
And then you'd think it still took them a few days of humming and on before they said, oh yeah, I guess we ought to throw the towel in. But yeah, so this you can imagine the response and parties in the streets and everything. That's actually a nurse. If you look close, a nurse's uniform, I think. And so this nurse was in town. And look at it, you could see all around those are the people in military uniform, including this guy, the sailor. And yes, apparently the photographs captured him, and just obviously they're all pissed and drunk, and he grabbed this woman and had a big kiss.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing, actually. You know the way at the time it was like, isn't that wonderful? The end of the war.
Yeah,
and then now it is. Then again, and apparently. I was reading something that witnesses said she wasn't too happy about it at the time.
Oh, really?
Like, get off me.
Yeah, of
well,
course.
Yeah, because in fairness, if you're
yeah.
some random stranger snogs you on the street, I'd be a bit annoyed too.
If you look at the people behind him, there's a few sailors laughing. Yeah. There's a few girls also laughing. So it's like she was chatting to the girls. They all passed by, and he just grabbed her or something. You know what I mean?
Time. Do you know what actually is a very interesting parallel to this? Do you remember there a couple of years ago, I think the previous Olympics, was the Paris Olympics, the Spanish women's soccer team, I think it was, won the gold medal. And the coach, Spanish guy, was all delighted, and he kind of grabbed one of his players and gave her a big smacker on the lips. Yeah. He ended up having to resign. She was furious. She was like, and basically, so you can imagine that would be the response to this today, in today's environment.
Okay.
Well, it would be unless we had some hero to save us from all this in the White House. You know what I mean?
Well, let's not talk about him. I heard a very interesting theory about why the Japanese gave up, and I'd like to know your opinion about this. Mm-hmm. It wasn't so much the atomic bombs. Now, obviously, that was a huge influence, but it was that the Russians joined the Eastern War, because as soon as Russia saw what was going on with the States, they were thinking, "Oh, hang on a sec now. We can get a lot of land here." So suddenly, their troops were finished in Europe on May the 8th or something like that, right? So they were all done. And then they saw...
they were free,
Yeah, so they basically saw what was going on beyond the Urals and beyond the Bering Sea. And they were thinking, okay, we need to get a bit of this. And do you think there's much adage to that the Japanese army said, well, we don't want to be communists, so we better give up?
I'd say absolutely. I think it's like everything's communist. I mean, obviously... The atomic bombings were a huge factor. I mean, because the extraordinary thing is, like, more people died in one night in Tokyo from a conventional raid because they firebombed the place, 100,000. So that was more than were killed in Nagasaki or Hiroshima because of the blast. I mean, more died radiation-wise later on. So, but it was just the psychological thing. Oh my God, this is one plane can do this, and this one bomb. So, and they didn't know the fact that it would have been a month or two before the Americans could have manufactured. These were like prototypes. They were almost experimental scientific devices. They weren't, as you would have got into a few years later, basically, manufactured nuclear weapons. So they had one more core, a plutonium core. So it would have been a week or two for the third bomb, if you like. But they were totally going to do it. But you're quite
Really?
right. I think it was a combination. It was obviously a huge factor. There was enough people with some sensibility in Japan, and they managed to persuade the emperor to their cause that, look, we're just going to be totally destroyed. I mean, come on, this is
Mm.
But you're right. What happened was Stalin had actually, it was part of the Allied agreement that he would join the war against Japan once the war in Europe was finished. And sure enough, the Soviet Red Army went into Manchuria, which was then Manchukuo, a Japanese held China, and they went through, the Japanese troops like shit through a goose, basically. I mean, the Japanese had no answer to it. But they didn't have that's probably the one time when the Red Army was basically unbeatable, like incredible tanks,
Was that
incredible
the
this,
wa-
and
was that the European Red Army? Like, was the army just
um,
shipped across on trains, basically from Europe over to the
oh
Far
yeah,
East,
some of it
basically?
would have been, but don't forget. I mean, if you look at the stories of like, we often tend to think of like the Red Army in Europe, like the guys going into Berlin and all that, as ethnically white Russians or Caucasian Russians. A lot of them were like Tatars and Kazakhs and Mongolians and you name it. Like it was a kind of a melting pot, you could say. But the story about the Japanese basically had a go at the Russians, the Chinese, Mongolian, Russian front there, Siberia, in 1939. It's called the Battle of Khalkhin Gol. And here, oddly enough, what's his name? Zhukov, the guy who was in charge and liberated Berlin
Georgie,
or
yeah.
attacked Georgie. Yeah, he was a very impressive guy. He was in charge of this, operation, and they absolutely hammered the Japanese. Like the Japanese couldn't cope with the Soviet armor and the weight of fire. And really, that was in 1939. That really made it, because there was two factions in Japanese military politics. It was like one group were saying, no, we should go with the Northern strategy, which is concentrating getting all we can out of Japan, and why don't we just take Siberia off those Russians? But then, and the other one was like the Pacific one, which is what they did: Pearl Harbor, taking of Singapore and all that, and Hong Kong. But that decision was made after 1939 because they realized, oh no, we have to avoid war with the Soviets at all costs. They'll clean our clocks. You know what I mean? They knew they were overmatched.
But don't forget
So
the Japanese sunk the Russian army or Russian navy in 1904 in 15 in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. The Russian navy sailed all the way around the world from the Baltic, didn't they?
the Russian Navy from the Pacific got sunk. And then they said, all right, we better send the Baltic fleet halfway around the world. And they did. And I think it got sunk within 10 minutes of arriving or something crazy. I mean, it was impressive in one sense. Yeah. Just to finish on that, just to say, yes, I mean, the Japanese are no slouches militarily, and they were always very good. And interestingly, when they were developing their navy, they just copied the best navy in the world, which was the Royal Navy at that time.
Mm.
And when they developed their army, they copied the German army. This is back, 150 years ago. But basically, one thing they didn't have, and it relates to like they didn't have the natural resources and industrial capacity to build big, heavy armored vehicles and artillery. So they had no answer to the Russians because that was their forte. Whereas sending guys out in the jungle and fighting Australians and Brits and Americans, that was different. That was all more one-to-one in the jungle, short range, and they were very good at that. So,
but don't forget as well, like most
strengths.
of what Japan got in the Far East was former European. So it was the Dutch East Indies, the French East Indies, Singapore. So all the European powers except the Germans were under. They couldn't afford to send troops out there. They had to defend the homeland, and the Japanese just walked into these places.
Of course, Indochina, as it was then, which is what Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, was under Vichy French rule. And so technically, they were the same sort of friendly. So the Japanese basically put pressure on them, say, we want free passage through Vichy, through French Indochina. And they agreed. And that's why they were able then to pour into Malaysia and capture Singapore, which at that time, and I think to date, is the largest ever surrender of British and Commonwealth forces, something like 250,000 or something crazy.
Amazing.
An absolute disaster.
Absolute disaster. Okay, listen, my friend, we'll call it a day there, right?
But they won in the end. They came back and won in the end. So, yeah.
2 World Wars, and is coming up to a second World Cup now. Is coming up soon.
Do you think?
know?
Really?
We'll see.
I know they got through, but
Yeah. Okay, let's say.
I don't think it's ever coming home.
Let's say goodbye there on the 50 minutes. All right.
All right.
Cheers.
No problem.
Bye.
Cheers, Phil.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.